Today on the Skid Factory, we're going to check out a car I built 20 years ago and have a laugh. Welcome back to the Skid Factory. This is my mate Sebby's 1975 HJ 1-ton ute. This is a Holden. It's a commercial vehicle originally, but now they're mostly just used for doing burnouts at power crews. Very common vehicle back in the day. It was your equivalent to your small pickup truck sort of thing. Brickies had them, fill up the back with sand, drive to the pub after work, that sort of thing. Nowadays, obviously not used as a commercial vehicle anymore, but they're very prevalent still because they sold so many of them, and they're a common car to do up. This car originally belonged to my friend Scott, who owns the Iron Lion, the supercharged 308 powered Kingswood station wagon. It's the same age as this. He bought the Kingswood wagon because he wanted more seats, and then Sebby then bought this off him. So the interesting thing about this car is it was actually the first vehicle that ever left the shed once it was built. So it's kind of like it was probably one of the first major conversions I did where I was really I didn't know what I was in foreign ground, I suppose. The car originally had a 350 4-bolt main Chev with double hump fuelies, which if you're like 57 years old, you'd probably think it was the greatest engine in the world. At the time, I was kind of like, oh sweet, it's got a 350 Chev in it, it must be fast. But it also had gas only, so it had gas throttle bodies on it and 2 giant gas tanks underneath it. It was rubbish, it used to break down all the time. He was using it as a work ute. Every morning at about 6:30, he'd call me and go, the tonner won't start, I'm at the servo. That was pretty much a recurring theme. So at some point, a couple of years later, after trying everything to make the thing start when you wanted it to, or even just move under its own power successfully, I got the shits with it and pulled out the engine and gearbox, sold it for $1,500, bought a Toyota Century half cut for $1,500, and proceeded to transplant that Toyota Century 1UZ and 4-speed auto into the tonner. That took a little while. I originally actually did it in the other shed that's now my son's bedroom. So a 6x6 shed. The majority of it was done there. This was built and I finished it off in here. It was driven around as a work ute still for a couple of years. Never missed a beat, used no fuel, super reliable, as you'd expect from a Toyota engine. So it was a success. Following that, he bought the Kingswood, the Iron Lion, and then Sebby bought this off him. And then we proceeded to add turbochargers and other things to it to make it actually fast. Does an okay power skid, and Sebby has got the most glorious mullet ever built. He's worked on that for years. Can make good jerky also. So clearly this thing is no oil painting, and that's kind of why we're having a bit of a look at it today. It's kind of a reflection on how things will change over the years when you're involved in modifying cars, how your skills change and how you see things differently. So this is a snapshot of what I did 20 years ago as a guy that was modifying cars, doing engine swaps and that sort of thing. And there's some really interesting engineering methods going on here, which we're going to have a quick look at. The car is very much worn out as far as it needs a resto and that sort of thing. And the engine's probably going to come out and go into another car, which is a sedan. So we thought we'd take this opportunity to have a look over it and laugh at the stuff that I did that long ago.
You said Century before too. Is that a one you said Century? Do you mean
I said Celsior.
You said Century.
I said Celsior.
All right, I'll play that replay.
Okay. Bought a Toyota Century half cut for $1,500. Toyota Century 1UZ and 4-speed auto. Centuries didn't have 1UZs in them.
Anyway, cool story, Toyota nerd.
Bro.
What's your favourite thing about the car that you look back on now?
It's got a turbo. No, this thing is very reliable. The turbo's been on there for 10 years or so, probably a bit more, and it makes about 400 and a bit horsepower, which is standard Toyota Power Cube TM. Smack on the turbo about that size, put a very basic ECU on it, decap some injectors out of a Subaru or a Toyota V12 or something like that, I don't know. Whatever I could find, intercooler, send it.
I love how Sebby's polished up all the pipes to distract you from the mess of everything else. Why has the bonnet cable come through here?
Because it's been shortened that many times over the years that it no longer reaches.
Oh, really?
And you know that there's an obvious way to fix that is to get one that's a new one and make it so it goes all the way over there. But that's clearly not a priority, so...
What about that thermostat housing that's about... I could touch that, it would crumble, I reckon.
That thermostat housing's been like that for about 13 years and it refuses to let go.
This is the kind of car that I would drive.
If you drove this, all of those things would break.
Would break.
The bonnet cable would melt, that'd split, everything would fall off it, and maybe that's what needs to happen.
So what turbo is that?
It's
Garrett 4094? No.
It's a GT4088 with a .88 exhaust housing, I think. So it's a very small exhaust housing. It comes on boost really fast. That turbo was originally on an EZ30 built engine, and somehow he ended up with it. I can't even tell you what sort of
Is it allonomic?
things happened for that to happen, but there it is. It's got like some cheap wastegate on. It needs to be replaced with a GFB. And
I think there's lots of things that need to be
it generally works much better than it looks. So
Custom alternator bracketry down here.
yeah, so it's got a
Keep it away from the power steering, leaking power steering pump.
we'll have a look underneath later, but it's got a rear sump conversion, which is a sheet metal thing that you could buy back in the day. Makes it so it bolts in.
Because of the inverted commas.
And by bolt in, I mean it bolts in, but nothing else will fit on the engine. So the alternator's been moved from down there where the steering box is to over here. At the time, I was a scratch start TIG welder, so no AC/DC.
Is that thing you had here?
Yeah, it's like I used to call it the mailbox. It was about this big. So everything was scratch start, so you had to basically bring your TIG down until it was almost touching and it would just strike. There was no button or anything, it was always live. So learning with something like that meant you have to be very steady with your hand because you can't just hold it in the vicinity and press the high frequency start button. So everything's made out of stainless steel because of that, because that's the only thing I could weld, that and mild steel. So you'll see stainless steel everywhere.
What's up with this little like sensor block here on the top of this?
So it had, because the Celsior, not the Century, had a hydraulic fan. So
Oh yeah.
the engine fan was like this, and it was hydraulic powered off a pump on the front of the engine. So I actually used that, and it worked really well, but you had to control it. And I couldn't control it with the factory setup because I probably couldn't get the wiring for it. So I just had a switch arrangement, which is probably that switch there that's not used anymore. So it would switch on when it got to a certain temperature, and when it switched on full noise, it basically would drag the car forward. It worked that good because it's not meant to be like that. It's meant to be PWM controlled, but that worked great for a year or so, and then I think I changed it to Subaru fans, as you do.
Is that some kind of Subaru oil filter thing there too?
Well, it's not really an oil filter thing. It's actually a Brumby oil pump.
Oh, what?
That I cut the ends off and tapped for fittings because I had them lying around, and I don't know, I guess you couldn't get like remote oil filter housings easily at the time, or I can't remember. So it's got some hydraulic line fittings on it and stuff. And yeah, the reason for that is because the actual oil filter housing wouldn't fit with the cross member.
Oh yeah.
So that's the remote filter. Well, originally I was working at a Subaru wrecker as a mechanic. I was doing a lot of Subaru engine swaps and stuff like that. So a lot of the stuff is out of the wrecking yard. So you'll see weird connectors that are brown coloured and stuff like that. They were in old Subaru L series, so I just used to harvest them and buy new terminals for them. This is this is sloppy mechanic stuff. Matt would be proud. So yeah, it's all been rewired, but because these Kingswoods the wiring looms in them are horrible after 20 or 30 years where everyone's been messing with them. So I replaced the fuse box, which had glass fuses in it, with one that I cut out of a Subaru L series. So I cut the entire fuse box assembly out of it with this much wires hanging off it.
Is that still in it?
Yeah, and used it because I didn't like glass fuses. In hindsight, I was probably not the most efficient way of going about it, but that was just the way where my head was at the time. So still in there, still works. As you can see, there's lots of horrible wiring and stuff, and this would have been all stolen out of other wiring looms. And this, I don't know where that came from, but it worked.
It still does work.
It does, yeah.
I reckon you should start it up and then you can hear it and then we can go up on the hoist. Is there stuff to laugh at underneath?
Yeah, probably heaps more stuff underneath to laugh at. Combination of old ton of stuff that's bent and worn out with new things welded onto the side of them.
Oof, how's the checker plate? Nice. You make that too?
I did. It's not to everyone's taste, including mine, but it was the fashion of the time.
It's still Sebby's fashion too.
Yeah, I think Sebby likes it actually. As you can see, it's got a bunch of VDO gauges in there, and the reason for that was that this transmission obviously doesn't have a speedo cable or anything because everything was electronic by then. So there was no way of making a tacho, which these things didn't usually have anyway, or the speedo work. So I went with this setup. So it's got temperature gauge and fuel gauge. The fuel gauge actually works backwards, but that's a whole other story. And it doesn't have the fuel tank out of a Kingswood in it either, which is another story.
Has it got an L series fuel tank?
No, it's got a Commodore fuel tank, Ute fuel tank in it.
Oh yeah.
With a pump inside it. This light here is a warning light for when you run out of water, because the original owner, Scott, was like hopeless at stuff like that. So I had a buzzer that shrieked at you when it ran out of water. And it did get used. This is the car I first realised what alternator lights did. I used an LED alternator light and obviously didn't work because the resistance of the bulb is the thing that excites the alternator. So under the dash there's another bulb just dangling, and that's the alternator warning light, but the one that actually makes the alternator charge is hanging down inside. So
under dash glow.
Yeah.
I started up, but it still sounds good.
This is also another thing that I learnt after this, is that obviously the key doesn't start, because when you go like this in an old car, it switches off the ignition supply and switches it over to a different circuit. And I didn't know how to make that work at the time, so it's just got a start button.
How good's that one New
I know how to make that work now.
You do?
Yeah.
Isn't that what a Nexus R5's for?
Yeah, that's one way of doing it.
Oh, just a fuse box.
Yeah, it used to be screwed down, but Sebby broke it. Look at that, that's pro.
That's legit.
It is. Fits in the same hole too.
Nice.
Can you give it a rev so I can hear that turbo noise? That's the sound we all know and love. You cracked the gate. Have you got the handbrake on?
Third.
Oh, thank you. Hang on.
Not sure if that's good for the engine.
Oh, that's heavy.
Trans brake.
What's that?
It's the A340 trans brake.
What's that? Small exhaust housing in
No,
third gear.
third gear and smack it back to first. Hope for the best. Hope there's some residual boost. This 1UZ has never been out of the car since I put it in there, I don't know, 20 years ago, 18 or 20 years, I can't remember. A long time ago. So, it's proven reliability.
Has it even had a timing belt done?
I think it had a time belt sticker on it when I bought the half cut, so I just said no. It's OG. It's got a few minor oil leaks going on, as you'd expect from a car of this age.
Just weeping personality, Alan.
Weeping horsepower.
So you use a Stocko Sora or Celsior.
That's that's the Celsior factory header on this side, which I shortened to make it fit in this chassis.
Oh, I can see.
Back in the day.
Yeah, I can see where you shortened it.
And then obviously it had a twin system on it. They used to thong slap like a boss back when it was non-turbo, when it was factory ECU. And when we turboed it, that's just some steam pipe off that manifold, and it goes up into like a T-branch log manifold thing up there, and it works perfectly fine.
This the weld over here looks like you filled quite the gap on that.
Yeah, that's a special patented system. That pipe goes right up and contacts and butts into the other header up inside.
That anti-leak.
That's well, it's just to match the piping size correctly.
And you mentioned fuel lines before too, Al. These look very
These-
mouldy, but
These multi-fuel.
look at them.
These are Subaru fuel lines that I pulled out of a Subaru wreck because I worked at a wrecking yard, so there was plenty of them around. Re-bent them to fit.
The other thing I love is the O2 sensor bung.
Yeah, so clearly I didn't have any bungs at the time, so just screwed like an old single wire in there and cut the connector off. Borg-wanted diff, similar to the ones we've used in a few other cars. Wayne's, the Fairlane prior to the 9-inch.
Didn't these come from like Yash's?
Yeah, which was Klopfie's, wasn't it?
That's right, I think it was.
So it's got like a Detroit locker or something in it. It's horrible.
One of those
It
clackety-clackers.
makes so many clanking and clacking noises. It's yeah, it's pretty interesting. This exhaust system would have been half made out of truck exhaust. So you can see the 80mm 409 stainless truck exhaust. I used to get that for free from the truck bodybuilding company next door, because they'd cut off most of the pipe when they put the bodies on and just have a pipe hanging out the side. So they used to have stacks, which no one uses, no one wants or uses. So I had like unlimited supplies of 80mm mandrel bends in 409. As many a vehicle was equipped with. Though for some reason there's small sections of actually, and that's something else.
That's a good. That looks like it's pretty tight. This one here.
Oh yeah. That's probably enough paint out on my 20 years former self for now. I think the moral of the story is you'll always get better at working on cars the more you do it. The only time you won't get better is if you never do it in the first place. So get out there and have a go, use what you've got, do it to the best standard you can, and then you can only go forward from there.
I'd like to know that like there's nothing wrong with what you've done and you've made it work and it still works.
And it's been working for 20
It
something.
just doesn't look
20 years.
nice. Like
Yeah.
that's all.
But that's it. You get better at it. It also hasn't been taken care of very well over the last many years. It's always been we're about to do it up. We're about to do it up. We're going to pull it apart. We're going to restore it, and that's probably going to happen. We might not end up with this engine in it. We're going to probably put that engine into a different car. So who knows what's going to happen? But It's done its job for the moment, so well done, little do pig. And that's all we got for you today.
When was the last time Sebby bought the 85? Because the last time I checked it,
He did. He bought it the other week. This is very economical because he doesn't drive it much.
he used jerry cans from leftover dyno tunes for years.
Yeah, that sounds very much like Sebby, yes. And it loves it. Never had an injector fail that he knows of. Alright, that's all we got for you. Hope you enjoyed this meander through my past, and thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Wastegate open in the shed for your mates on a Sunday Arvo trick that I just did then. That's how he actually blew the diff that was in it. It had the diff that's in it now was sitting on the tray, and it was going to get driven to the workshop in the morning. And yeah, the wastegate open. That worked mint the first time, but the second time it smashed the pinion into 1,000 bits and he had to tow truck it to work.